A gender row has erupted in Olympic boxing after IMENE Khelif and Angela Carini and their welterweight bout in Paris yesterday was brought to an end after just 46 seconds. Italian Carini it was who threw in the towel after just 2 punches from her Algerian opponent, who was last year disqualified from the Women's World Championships in New Delhi for failing a gender eligibility test. We are delighted to be joined by Dr Emma Hilton, developmental biologist at the University of Manchester and a trustee of charity Sex Matters. Where do we start with all this? There's so much misinformation being floated around, particularly online. It's a very delicate subject indeed. We're delighted that you're joining us to help us wade through some of it. In your opinion, for people who don't understand but want to, where do we start?
So I think the most obvious starting point is to understand why we have men's sport and women's sport. And that's because of male biology. It's about how males grow. It's about having testosterone that gives men bigger muscles, that makes them run faster. And so for those kinds of reasons, we separate men and women in sport. And it's quite important for women to have that separate category so that they can, compete against people that have got the same type of biology as they do. That makes it fair, it makes it a level playing field for female athletes. And so what's tricky when we think about that category separation is people that don't necessarily, cleanly fit into one or the other category. And that's when we start to think about people with medical conditions, maybe differences, disorders of sex development, where it's not very obvious which category they go into.
So first, can you explain to us what a DSD is?
So a DSD in, a disorder or a difference of sex development means that someone doesn't have the kind of typical reproductive system that males have or that females have. So they have either usually a genetic disorder that means they just don't develop typically. And that can be quite ambiguous then to understand whether they're male or female. And in this case then, as I say, which sporting category it's fair for them to compete in. So your audience will be aware of Caster Semenya, I think, who is the most famous athlete with a DSD. And while we understand about Caster Semenya's life and the fact that Semenya was observed female, she was born and people looked and said it's a girl. What we understand now about Semenya's biology is that all of that internal stuff, all of the the internal biology and physiology is male. So XY chromosomes, testes, these testes are making testosterone in the male range, and Semenya's body can respond to that in the way that a male does. And that's important for sport. And we're starting to see sports federations, start to wrestle with this issue about, someone who may well be socially female, who may well be very reasonably recorded as female on legal documents, but whose biology in a sports relevant way is actually more like a male.
With the situation we're talking about here, just to remind people, the Khelif was disqualified from the Women's World Championships in New Delhi in March 2023. At that time, the World Championships, that was an IBA event, an International Boxing Association event. And until fairly recently, the IOC had the IBA not running their events, but they used the IBA rules and regulations as the sort of foundation for any IOC Olympic competition. So they recognised their eligibility standards or eligibility requirements. The IOC have recently stripped the IBA of that role and have set up a specific authority, Paris 2024 sort of boxing hub, if you like, and they recognise many of the IBA rules, but one of them isn't the gender eligibility test. It's unclear exactly what tests were used by the IBA when Khelif was disqualified from the World Championships in New Delhi. But one thing we have had come out of the IBA is that she failed an XY chromosome test. Now, just explain to us the typical differences between X and Y and XX chromosomes between the genders, and what you feel may have happened in this case.
Yes, so what we know is that the IBA disqualified Khelif for, as you say, failing a gender test. We take that to mean a test for Khelif's sex. And we know that the IBA categories are very clearly defined as XY, the male category, and XX, the female category. So we could infer, and that, you know, they also talk about lab testing. So I think we could infer that they've done some chromosome analysis on Khelif and found XY, and that's the chromosome, the sex chromosome conformation that you typically find in men. Okay, so that's the first flag that there's something going on here. You know, that this is someone who may, you know, have been registered as female, but who has male chromosomes.
If a person is presenting as a female, as you put it, but has the XY chromosome, which is typically the male chromosome, what would the symptoms or what would happen as a result of that?
So what we would, you know, we know the presentation, the symptoms, as you say, the presentations of these medical conditions. And in something like a DSD, like 5ARD, which is the one Caster Semenya has, we have XY chromosomes. And what that's doing during development, you know, when baby's growing in the womb, what that's doing is directing male type development. So testes, testosterone, all of this, these, you know, male specific hormone balances that ultimately will give you, you know, external genitalia that looks like a boy, and then they're born and you know, the baby looks like a boy. But in DSD, something's going wrong in this pathway. And so what you can have is a baby who looks female, but who has testes. You know, XY chromosomes, they're driving male development. So they have testes. And during childhood, you know, boys and girls are fairly similar in size. They don't always look particularly different when they're running around a sports field. But during puberty, what you have in boys is this massive surge of testosterone coming from those testes. And this is really driving a huge gap in physical difference between boys and girls than men and women. And it's that gap that's the basis of sex categories. So increased height, big muscle mass, big shoulders, narrow hips, all of that strength and lung capacity and heart volume that we associated with being male and important in sport, that's happening in these DSDs. So these athletes may look female, but they have male advantage.
Not to put too fine of a point on it, but that would be for the layman, externally, the genitalia, for example, would be female, but internally there may be some male organs in there as well.
Yes, so testes, which would, you know, in a healthy male be testicles, you know,
and external.
And external.
Yeah.
So these are kind of often retained inside, and therefore they're not visible, you know, at birth. Babies with some DSDs, not all DSDs, but some DSDs, may look female at birth, but are going to experience male development. They're going to be tall, they're going to grow muscles, they're going to have the typical heart and lung volume of males. And this is why in sports we need to think about what that means for fairness for females who can't access that kind of development because their internal biology is female. And you know, it is presenting quite an issue because we need to understand these are athletes with medical conditions. We're not accusing athletes with DSDs of cheating. We're not suggesting that, you know, we need to make any kind of moral judgment here. We have to have empathy for athletes that have got medical conditions, particularly ones, you know, that can be really confusing for people. But we do also need to have fairness for female athletes, and that means keeping out of the female category athletes that have male biology that that matters for sport.
Khelif, and to perhaps dispel some of the myths that are going around on social media particularly, and among people I've spoke to this morning. Only this morning someone said to me, it's disgusting that they're letting a transgender person compete in the women's category. Out and out, not true. It's just worth pointing out, is it not, that Khelif was born this way, and there's no insinuation of any sort of artificial adaptions or anything.
Yeah, we don't really need to think about anything beyond male biology. However, that's the reason we don't need to evoke gender identities. I don't know Khelif's gender identity, for, or whether one has been claimed. We don't need to speculate or hypothesize or talk about anything about their lives other than the fact of their biology. And as far as we know, Khelif's biology is male in a way that matters for sport.
Okay, so if you were in charge, Dr Hilton, and you were employed by the IOC to run their boxing competition, where would you draw the line? Because it feels like that's what we're trying to get at here, is that a line needs to be drawn somewhere. Where and how would you draw that line?
So boxing as a sport is obviously quite different from a lot of other sports. There are massive safety considerations to take into account for boxing. So I think it's really urgent that someone starts to find a solution here for boxing. I think there's fairness issues across all sports, but boxing really is quite urgent to get sorted. A male-female category is the only way, and I think that has to be very strictly applied. We understand with this collective group of medical conditions, we understand for most, if not all of them, I think, how that affects sporting advantage. We understand whether it means that someone is going to start to have male physical characteristics, big muscles and heart and lungs and that kind of thing. We understand these DSDs, which way at puberty, are they going to develop, and sorting by that, has there been male development that's relevant for how hard you can punch someone, and if there is biology that's going to help you punch someone harder because you've got male biology, then you simply cannot have that biology in a female ring. It's dangerous. It's not just unfair, it's dangerous.
I think it is worth pointing out that in Khelif's career so far, 37 wins, 9 defeats in the women's category as well. Just there's one thing that sort of, to give a bit of balance to the story. So is it as simple then as just saying, look, anyone with XY chromosomes cannot compete in a female sporting category, particularly, as you say, boxing, where the stakes are a little higher?
As a general rule of thumb, no XY in the female category is going to capture almost every type of body that you don't want in the female ring. Okay, so it's a very good rule of thumb. There's tension across a lot of sports federations that are struggling to make fair, sensible, sympathetic regulations, particularly around people with DSDs. And I think we need some clear guidance from perhaps the International Olympic Committee. I don't think they've given very clear guidance to these international domestic federations so far. But I also think there is a fairly easy solution here, which is the concept of cheek swabbing people, of assessing chromosomes, of using that to, understand what sports category someone might belong in, and stopping this before what you have is an athlete in the spotlight with all of this social media horror, all of the headlines. There's a duty of care to the athletes as well to not let it get this far. And a simple cheek swab, what are your chromosomes? And then, let's start to think about, where are you going to play sport? So
do you feel then, you mentioned there about duty of care to the athlete, and I think that's very important that people hold that in their minds, that IMENE Khelif is a human being who's, born the way she was born, and is competing within the rules set out by this particular body here. Do you feel the IOC have let her down at all, or they've created this situation where, because remember, it's not only IMENE Khelif, it's also Taiwan's Lin Yu-ting as well. There's two athletes here who were previously disqualified from the World Championships. Do you feel like the IOC have kind of set them up for to be the centre of all of this furore?
It's quite interesting that the IOC haven't, I think, you know, whatever their issue is with the IBA, that they have not paid attention to what the IBA is saying about the sex of these athletes, and that when, you know, they're almost, I think, shutting down conversation at some points. They're basically saying don't question this, and I think it's very reasonable for people to question a sports federation that you know, has said these athletes aren't eligible for the female category. And when people are questioning the IOC, they're just saying you can't ask questions. They've, you know, there's female on their passport. We're not talking about passports or birth certificates. We're talking about sex biology. And I don't think the IOC have helped. I think that, you know, people have sex testing all the time. And I think this could have just been done ahead of the competition. And then that would have allowed the IOC to say, we've done it, and this is, you know, this is what's happening. And that might have engendered some kind of public confidence in what's going on. But at the moment, everything is up in the air. And I don't think the IOC are dealing with it very well. And I think that is to the detriment of the athletes.